The morning air was cold in the mountains of South Korea. Dai checked his watch and looked at the 5 students standing before him. They were city people who had paid good money to learn how to survive in the wild. His eyes moved from their clean hiking boots to their expensive backpacks. They had the gear, but they didn't have the knowledge. Not yet. Today, we learn how to make fire without matches, Dai said, his voice firm but kind. He had done this hundreds of times since leaving the Special Forces. Teaching civilians was different from training soldiers, but he enjoyed it. These people chose to learn, and that made all the difference. As he bent down to gather dry leaves, a bright flash lit up the sky. Dai's military training kicked in instantly. His eyes locked onto the source, a streak of blue-white light cutting through the clouds. It wasn't a plane. It moved too fast, too strangely. As it fell, it left a trail of smoke and sparks. The object crashed somewhere in the dense forest below them. The ground shook, and birds flew from the trees in panic. A cloud of dust rose above the treetops. "Sir, shouldn't we call emergency services?" one of his students asked, already pulling out her phone. Dai raised his hand. "No signal up here," he said calmly, though his mind was racing. "That looks like it could start a forest fire. We need to get down to the ranger station." He pointed to the path leading back to safety. "Follow the blue markers. Stay together. I'll be right behind you." The students hesitated, but they trusted him. As they started down the path, Dai waited until they were out of sight. Then he turned and moved quickly through the forest, toward the crash site. His feet found safe places to step without him having to look down. Years of training had made this as natural as walking. The crash site was easy to find. Whatever had hit the ground had left a long scar in the earth. Trees lay broken like matchsticks. The air smelled strange, like metal and ozone, like nothing he'd smelled before. Dai moved carefully, staying low, using the fallen trees as cover. At the end of the scar was something that made him stop and stare. It wasn't a meteor. It wasn't a satellite. It was a ship, sleek and silver, about the size of a small car. Part of it had broken open, revealing strange lights inside. A sound made him duck behind a fallen tree. Something was moving inside the ship. He heard metal scraping against metal, then a thud. Peering over the tree trunk, Dai saw something climb out of the wreck. It looked almost human, but not quite. It wore armor that seemed to shift colors like oil on water. The helmet was smooth, with no visible faceplate. The figure stumbled, caught itself against the ship's hull, then collapsed. Dai's mind told him to leave, to call someone. The military, the government, anyone. But his eyes caught something that changed everything. The figure was bleeding. The blood was dark purple, but the way it flowed, the way the figure held its side, these were things he had seen before. This was a wounded warrior. He remembered being trapped behind enemy lines years ago, wounded alone, until a local villager found him. That villager had every reason to turn him in or leave him to die. Instead, they helped him. They saved his life. Dai stood up. He stepped out from behind the tree, his hands raised to show he carried no weapons. The figure's helmet turned toward him. A soft clicking sound came from it, like someone trying to speak through broken machinery. Then the helmet cracked open, revealing a face that was both alien and familiar. The eyes were larger than human eyes, and they glowed faintly. The skin was pale blue, but the expression, pain, fear, determination, that was something Dai understood perfectly. The warrior tried to stand, to take a defensive position, but the wound was too severe. As they started to fall again, Dai moved forward and caught them. The armor was surprisingly light. In that moment, holding a wounded alien warrior in his arms, Dai made his choice. Some things went beyond planets and species. A warrior helps another warrior. That was true anywhere in the universe. He didn't know it then, but that choice would change not only his life, but potentially the fate of 2 worlds. For now, though, he had a simpler mission: Keep this warrior alive. Day carried the wounded alien warrior to a small cave he knew nearby. He had used it before to teach students about emergency shelters. Now it would serve a different purpose. The warrior was light in his arms, despite the armor. Each step made the alien's breathing quicken with pain. Inside the cave, Dodd gently set the warrior down on a flat rock. He pulled off his backpack and took out his first aid kit. Years of military service had taught him to always carry good medical supplies. But as he looked at the alien's wound, he wondered if human medicine would even work. The warrior's eyes watched his every move. They glowed a soft blue in the dim light of the cave. The alien tried to speak again, making clicking sounds that seemed to come from both their throat and their damaged helmet. "I'm going to help you," Day said, keeping his voice calm and steady. He pointed to himself. "Die." Then he pointed to the first aid kit and made a wrapping motion around his own side, where the alien was wounded. The warriors seemed to understand. They nodded, a surprisingly human gesture, and carefully moved their hands away from the wound. The armor around it had already changed color, turning clear like glass. Day realized it was trying to help him see the injury. The cut was deep, and the purple blood was still flowing. But blood was blood, and a cut was a cut. Day had patched up enough wounds to know what to do. He cleaned the area with antiseptic wipes. The alien flinched but stayed still. Good. They could feel pain, which meant they might react to medicine the same way humans did. As he worked, Day noticed more things about the warrior. Their armor wasn't just technology. It seemed almost alive, shifting and adjusting to help him reach the wound. The alien's face had markings that looked like silver tattoos. And despite being injured, they moved with the controlled precision that Day recognized from other skilled fighters. The warrior pointed to themselves and made a sound. "Era." Day looked up from his work. "Era," he repeated. The alien nodded again. He finished cleaning the wound and took out a special military-grade bandage. Before he could use it, Era reached for their armor. A small panel opened, revealing what looked like a medical kit. Inside was a silvery gel in a clear tube. Era pointed to the gel, then the wound, then made a motion like something healing. Day understood. He nodded and took the tube. The gel was cool to the touch and smelled like mint. When he applied it to the wound, it spread on its own, sealing the cut. The alien's breathing became easier almost immediately. But just as Day was feeling good about their progress, Era suddenly stiffened. They grabbed his arm and pointed up at the sky through the cave entrance. Their other hand made quick gestures. "Danger. Coming. Hide." Day didn't need to understand alien language to know what that meant. Someone was coming for Era, and they weren't friends. He quickly packed up his medical supplies and covered the cave entrance with branches, an old trick that still worked well. Inside the now dark cave, Era's eyes provided just enough light to see. The alien warrior pressed something on their armor, and suddenly they became harder to see, like looking through water. Active camouflage, Day realized. Very useful. He pulled out his phone and opened his hiking map app. Even without signal, it could show their location. He pointed to their position, then made a walking motion with his fingers, asking Era where they needed to go. The alien studied the map for a moment, then pointed to a spot deep in the mountains. It was a rough area. Steep cliffs, thick forests, lots of old mines. Perfect for hiding. Day knew those mountains well. He trained there, survived there, and now he would use that knowledge to keep them both alive. A distant sound made them both freeze. It was like a helicopter, but wrong somehow. Too quiet, too smooth. Era's hand tightened on their weapon, a sleek device that hadn't been visible a moment before. Day touched their arm and shook his head. Fighting wasn't an option right now. They needed to move, to hide, to survive. He had done it before, and he would do it again. Only this time, his student was a warrior from the stars, and their classroom was about to become a battleground. Dawn broke over the mountains as 3 black vehicles drove up the narrow road to the ranger station. They moved silently, too silently for normal cars. The man who stepped out of the first vehicle looked human, but his movements were too perfect, too smooth. His name tag read, Sang, Special Investigator. The local rangers stood nervously as Sang and his team set up their equipment. "We're investigating a meteor crash," Sang told them in perfect Korean. "The area is now under government control. Please give us all your maps of the region." Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Dai and Ara were already moving. They had spent the night in an old mining tunnel, and now they needed to find a new hiding place. Dai watched Ara check a small device on their armor. The alien's wound was better, but they still moved carefully. Ara pointed to the device's screen. It showed several dots moving toward their location. Dai understood. The hunters were getting closer. He pulled out his own map and pointed to a place marked with a small X. "Water," he said simply, making a swimming motion. Ara tilted their head, not understanding at first. Dai picked up a stick and drew in the dirt. People walking, then water, then no footprints. Ara's eyes brightened with understanding. They reached the stream an hour later. The water was cold and fast-moving. Perfect. Dai had used this trick before. Water didn't leave tracks. He and Ara walked in the stream, letting the current wash away any trace of their passage. But as they moved, Dai noticed something wrong. The forest was too quiet. No birds singing, no small animals moving in the bushes. He held up his hand, and Ara stopped immediately. They both pressed against the stream bank, under overhanging roots. A quiet humming passed overhead. Through the leaves, Dai saw something that looked like a drone, but it bent light around itself, almost invisible. Ara's hand tightened on their weapon. The drone paused, hovering, its sensors scanning the area. Dai remembered an old trick. He picked up a stone and threw it far downstream. The splash echoed in the quiet forest. The drone turned and moved quickly toward the sound. As soon as it was gone, they climbed out of the stream on the opposite bank. "We need to move faster," Dai whispered, even though he knew Ara couldn't understand his words. But they understood his tone. They pointed to their device again, showing more dots appearing on the screen. The hunters were spreading out, forming a net around them. Suddenly, Ara pushed Dai down behind a fallen tree. A moment later, 2 figures walked past their hiding place. They looked like park rangers, but their movements were wrong, just like Sang's. They carried what looked like hiking poles, but Ara's reaction told Dai those were weapons. The false rangers stopped nearby. They spoke in strange clicks and whistles, the same sounds Ara's damaged helmet had made. Dai stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. One wrong move, one snapped twig, and they would be found. The hunters moved on, but Dai and Ara waited 5 long minutes before moving again. The sun was getting higher, making it harder to stay hidden. They needed a better plan than just running. Dai took out his map again. He pointed to a place deep in the mountains marked with a circle. Ara looked at it, then at him, waiting for an explanation. Dai drew in the dirt again. A box with many rooms, hidden by trees. An old military bunker he had discovered years ago. It wasn't on any official maps. Ara studied his drawing, then nodded. But getting there wouldn't be easy. The hunters were between them and the bunker. They would have to be smart, be patient, and use every trick Dai had learned in his years of training. As if to emphasize the danger, another drone passed overhead. More dots appeared on Ara's device. The hunt was getting serious now. The hunters didn't know these mountains, but they had technology and numbers on their side. But Dai smiled slightly. Technology was good, but knowledge was better. These mountains had been his training ground, his home, his teacher. Now they would help him protect Ara. The hunters thought they were chasing weak prey. They were wrong. They were in his territory now, and he knew all its secrets. The old military bunker was better than Ara expected. The thick concrete walls blocked signals, keeping them hidden from the hunters' scanners. Da had led them there through hidden paths and old animal tracks, carefully covering their trail. Now, as rain fell outside, they had their first chance to really learn about each other. Da sat cross-legged on the floor, watching as Era tried to fix their damaged helmet. The alien warrior had spread out several small tools that seemed to float in the air. "Here," Da said, pulling out his own toolkit. He picked up a small flashlight and held it up, offering to help. Era looked at it, then made a sound that might have been a laugh. They touched their armor, and suddenly the whole room was filled with soft light. Da nodded, impressed. He pointed to the light, and then to Era's armor, tilting his head in question. Era understood. They pressed another spot on their armor, and a small hologram appeared above their wrist. It showed various pieces of the armor, each one lighting up as Era pointed to it. The alien warrior then pointed to Da's boots, his backpack, his compass. Now it was Da's turn to teach. He laid out his survival gear on the floor. He showed Era how to use each tool: the fire starter, the water filter, the emergency radio. The alien was fascinated by how simple and effective these tools were. As they shared knowledge, they also created their own way of talking. They drew pictures, used hand signals, and soon had their own simple language. Era learned to say danger and safe in Korean. Dad learned that a clicking sound followed by a whistle meant hunter nearby. But the most interesting moments came when they showed each other how they fought. In a cleared space in the bunker, Era demonstrated their fighting style. It was beautiful to watch, smooth, flowing movements that used the armor's technology. They could change direction in midair and move faster than any human. Then Dai showed his own style. Years of special forces training had taught him to use anything as a weapon, to move silently, to survive. He demonstrated how to hide in plain sight, how to use the environment as a weapon. Era watched carefully, recording everything with their helmet systems. During a break, Era pulled up another hologram. This one showed their home world, a planet with 3 moons and beautiful ring systems. They pointed to themselves, then to a symbol that appeared. Day realized they were showing him their role, some kind of space police or guardian. Day nodded and pulled out his old military ID. He pointed to himself, then made motions of fighting and helping others. Era's eyes glowed brighter. They understood. They were both protectors, just on different scales. As night fell, they took turns keeping watch. During his shift, Dan noticed how Era's armor adapted to the cold, changing its structure slightly. When it was Era's turn to watch, they saw how Da could sit perfectly still for hours, blending into the shadows in a way their technology couldn't copy. But it wasn't all serious training. Da found himself smiling as Era tried to eat with chopsticks, making a mess of the military rations. And Era seemed amused when Da accidentally activated something in their armor that made him float a few inches off the ground. They were from different worlds, but they were both warriors. They understood duty, honor, and sacrifice. When Era showed Da a hologram of their family back home, he saw the same look in their eyes that he had seen in his fellow soldiers, the look of someone far from home, fighting for what they believed in. A noise outside made them both move instantly into defensive positions. Their different fighting styles now worked together perfectly, Era's technology and Da's tactical knowledge combining naturally. The noise turned out to be just a falling branch, but they stayed alert. They both knew this peaceful time wouldn't last. The hunters were still out there, getting closer. But now they weren't just 2 random warriors thrown together by chance. They were partners who understood each other's strengths and weaknesses. They were ready for whatever came next. Police Chief Hyun stood at the edge of the forest, looking at the strange marks on the ground. 3 days had passed since the supposed meteor crash, and things weren't adding up. The government team led by Sang hadn't let anyone near the crash site, but Hyun had been a police officer for 20 years. He knew when something was wrong. Meanwhile, Dai and Ara were running out of safe places to hide. The hunters had split into small groups, searching every cave and valley. Worse, they had started asking questions in the nearby villages. Soon someone would remember the survival instructor who knew these mountains so well. "We need supplies," Dai whispered as they watched a hunter team pass below their hiding spot in the trees. Their food was almost gone, and he needed to clean Era's wound again. Era pointed to their device, showing a map of the search patterns. The hunters were everywhere except. They pointed to a small town at the edge of the mountains. Dai nodded. The town had a small market where he often bought supplies, but going there would be dangerous. They waited until dark to move. Era's armor changed color to match the night, while Dai wore his dark training clothes. They moved silently through the forest, using all the skills they had practiced. When they heard drones overhead, they froze, becoming part of the landscape. The town was quiet when they reached it. Dai left Era hidden behind the market and went inside. The old woman who owned the shop knew him well. "Dai, where have you been?" she asked. "The police were asking about you." Dai kept his face calm as he bought food and medical supplies. "Just training in the mountains," he said. "What police?" "Chief Hen and some government men. They say there's something dangerous in the mountains." Before Dai could answer, he saw red lights reflect in the shop window. Hunter vehicles. They were coming down the main street. "I need to go," he said quickly, grabbing his bags. "Please, if anyone asks." The old woman smiled. "I haven't seen you in weeks." Dai slipped out the back door just as the vehicle stopped in front. He ran to where he had left Ara, his heart pounding. But the alien warrior wasn't there. Then he heard voices from the street, hunter voices, trying to sound human but not quite managing it. They were getting closer to his hiding spot. Suddenly, there was a crash from the other side of town. The hunters turned toward the noise. Dai saw a figure running across rooftops. Era, creating a distraction. The hunters rushed toward the movement, their disguises forgotten in their excitement. Dai used the moment to escape in the opposite direction. He and Ara had planned meeting points for situations like this. He headed for the closest one, an old shrine in the forest. He waited there for 2 hours, worried that Ara had been caught. Then a shadow moved, and Ara appeared. They had a few new scratches on their armor, but they were safe. But their problems weren't over. As they started to leave, they heard voices on the path. Chief Hen was leading a group of local police, searching the shrine area. Dai and Ara pressed themselves against the shrine's dark walls. The police were blocking the only path down the mountain. They were trapped. Ara touched Dai's arm and pointed up. Their armor could help them climb the steep cliff behind the shrine. But Dai shook his head and pointed to the police. If they climbed now, they would be seen. Chief Hen's flashlight beam swept closer. Dai could hear him talking. "The tracks lead here. Something's been using this shrine." Just then, a hunter drone appeared overhead. The police didn't see it, but Dai and Ara did. If the drone spotted the police, the hunters would know exactly where to look. They had seconds to make a choice. If they ran, they would be seen. If they stayed, they would be found. If they fought, they would expose themselves to both the police and the hunters. Dai looked at Ara. In the dark, their eyes glowed faintly as they waited for his signal. They had trained for this. Now it was time to use everything they had learned from each other. Just before Chief Hen's flashlight reached them, the shrine's old wind chimes began to ring loudly. Everyone looked up at the unexpected sound, giving Dai and Ara just enough time to slip away into the shadows. They moved silently through the dark forest, using every trick they knew. But they couldn't keep running forever. The hunters were getting better at finding their trails, and now the police were involved too. Dai knew they needed help. There was only one person he could trust, his old mentor, Jin. Jin lived alone in a small house at the edge of an abandoned military base. He had been a commander in the special forces before Dai, and he knew more about survival than anyone. Getting to his house meant crossing open ground, but they had no choice. They waited until the darkest part of night. Era's scanner showed 3 hunter teams nearby, but there was a gap in their search pattern. Dad led them through it, moving from shadow to shadow. Jin was sitting on his porch when they arrived, as if he had been expecting them. His white hair glowed in the moonlight. He didn't seem surprised to see Da with an alien warrior. "I wondered when you would come," Jin said calmly. "The tea is already hot." Inside the house, Jin listened to Da's quick explanation. He watched Ara with curious eyes, especially when the alien warrior showed their fighting style. "Interesting," Jin said. 20 years ago, when I was still in service, I saw something similar." Da and Ara both looked at him in surprise. Jin walked to an old cabinet and took out a dusty box. Inside was a piece of metal with the same shifting colors as Era's armor. "We found it after a strange light in the sky," Jin explained. "The government took everything else. But I kept this piece. I always knew they would come back." Era examined the metal carefully. Their eyes glowed brighter, and they made quick clicking sounds. They pointed to the metal, then to their armor, then drew a line between them. "Your people have been watching us," Da said, understanding. Era nodded. Jin smiled. "That's why these hunters can't find you. They think they're chasing scared prey. They don't realize they're fighting 2 trained warriors." A beeping sound came from Era's scanner. Hunter vehicles were approaching. Jin didn't look worried. "The old base has underground tunnels," he said. "The government forgot about them years ago. They connect to bunkers all through the mountains." He pulled out a map that showed a network of red lines under the mountain. Da looked at the map in amazement. These tunnels would change everything. They could move without being seen, set traps, appear and disappear like ghosts. Era studied the tunnel map, then showed their own map of the hunter positions. Together, they could see patterns they hadn't noticed before. The hunters were being pushed toward something, a specific area in the mountains. "They're not just chasing you," Jin said, pointing to the pattern. "They're looking for something else too." Before they could discuss more, Era's scanner beeped again. The hunters were too close now. Jin quickly rolled up the maps. "Take the tunnel behind the house," he said. "It will lead you to a bunker 3 miles east. I'll make sure they look west instead." "It's too dangerous," Da protested. "If they catch you." Jin laughed. "I'm just a retired old man who likes to garden. What could I know about aliens?" As they prepared to leave, Jin pulled Da aside. "There's something else you should know," he whispered. "Last week, before all this started, there were other lights in the sky. Whatever the hunters want, you're not the only ones looking for it." Da nodded, understanding the warning. The game was bigger than they had thought. He and Ara weren't just running anymore. They were part of something much larger. They slipped into the tunnel as the hunter vehicles reached Jin's house. Above them, they could hear Jin's cheerful voice greeting the hunters, playing the role of a helpful old man perfectly. In the darkness of the tunnel, Era's eyes glowed like stars. They had new allies now, new paths to take, and new mysteries to solve. But most importantly, they had hope. The underground tunnels were like a maze, but Da and Era moved through them confidently. They had spent 3 days studying Jin's maps, marking safe spots and escape routes. Now they were heading to the place where all the hunter search patterns pointed. As they walked, Era suddenly stopped and touched their helmet. The damage was finally fixed. A soft blue light filled the tunnel as they activated its systems. "Now I can explain everything," Era said in perfect Korean. Their voice was musical, with an odd echo. "The helmet's translator is working again." Day sat down on a fallen piece of concrete. After all their time communicating with gestures and drawings, hearing Era speak was strange. "I am part of the Stellar Guard," Era explained. "We protect developing worlds from dangerous technology. Earth is one of our most important charges. Because we're not ready for advanced weapons," Da said, understanding. Era nodded. "Sang and his team are weapons dealers. They find young civilizations and sell them technology they're not prepared to handle. Usually, it leads to war. They pulled up a hologram showing different planets. Some were beautiful and green. Others were burned and broken. Day understood the message. This was what happened when worlds got technology too soon. But why are they searching this area so hard? Day asked. Era's eyes dimmed slightly. 3 months ago, one of our ships crashed here. The pilot died, but not before hiding something important. Plans for weapons that could destroy entire cities. We thought they were lost forever. Until Sang found a clue, Dai finished. He remembered Jin's words about other lights in the sky. Yes, if they find those plans, they won't just sell weapons to Earth. They'll build them here, using your planet as their factory. Your people won't have any choice. Day thought about this. He had seen what normal weapons did to people, to countries. The idea of something worse made his stomach turn. A noise echoed through the tunnel. They both froze, listening. Footsteps were coming closer. The hunters had found the tunnel network. We need to find those plans first, Dai whispered. You said the pilot hid them. Where would they go? Era brought up another hologram, this one showing the mountain. The crash site was here, they pointed. But there's something strange about this area. They pointed to a spot that all the hunter search patterns avoided. Day looked closely at the map. That's the old temple complex. The monks left it years ago. The hunter's sensors probably can't read it well because of the stone walls. A perfect hiding place, Era said. But why haven't the hunters searched it? Day smiled. Because they can't. The locals think the temples are haunted. Even the police stay away. The hunters are trying to blend in. They can't do anything that would draw attention. They looked at each other, having the same thought. The dead pilot must have known about Earth's customs. They had used local beliefs to protect their secret. But their planning was interrupted by more footsteps. The hunters were getting closer. Era's scanner showed 3 teams converging on their position. They're hurting us, Day realized. They know we figured it out. They want us to lead them to the temple. Era checked their weapon. We can't let them get those plans. My people have protected Earth for centuries. I won't be the one who fails. Day thought quickly. The hunters were blocking the way forward, and behind them was Jin's house. They couldn't go back and put his old mentor in danger. Then he remembered something from his training days. He pulled out the map again and pointed to a small mark. There's an old well shaft here. It leads to the surface near the temple. It'll be a hard climb, but better than fighting all of them, Era finished. Their translator made the smile clear in their voice. They moved quickly and quietly through the tunnels. Behind them, hunter lights began to appear. The race was on, not just to save themselves now, but to save Earth from a danger it didn't even know existed. As they ran, Dai thought about everything Era had told him. Earth had been protected all this time, watched over by warriors from the stars. Now he was part of that protection, a human warrior and an alien warrior, working together to keep his world safe. The old well shaft was narrower than Dad remembered. He and Ara climbed slowly, pressing their backs against one side and their feet against the other. Water dripped down the ancient stones. Above them, a circle of night sky grew larger with each step. They're following us, Era whispered. Their scanner showed multiple dots moving through the tunnels below. Day nodded. Good. The longer they spend in the tunnels, the more time we have to search the temple. They reached the top just as the moon broke through the clouds. The temple complex stood before them, its stone walls black against the sky. Ancient statues watched them with empty eyes. The plans must be here somewhere, Era said, scanning the buildings. But there are so many places to look. Day studied the temples. He had trained here before, using the complex for stealth exercises. Think like the pilot, he said. They were injured, running out of time. They needed somewhere easy to reach, but hard to find. They moved through the temple grounds, checking every shadow. Their footsteps echoed off the stone walls. Era's scanner kept beeping. The hunters were getting closer. Then Daz stopped. One of the statues was different from the others. Its base had scratches that looked random. But, "Here," he said. "These marks, they're like the writing on your armor." Era examined the scratches. "It's a warning." And instructions. They pressed certain marks in sequence. The statue's base slid open with a soft click. Inside was a small metal cube covered in shifting patterns. As soon as Era touched it, it glowed with blue light. "The plans," they said with relief. "Now we just need to." "Give them to me," a cold voice said. They turned. Sang stood in the temple doorway, flanked by 4 hunters. All of them had dropped their human disguises. In the moonlight, their true forms were like living shadows. "You fought well," Sang said, "but now it's over. The plans, or you both die." Day looked around quickly. More hunters were appearing at every door. They were surrounded. But Day smiled. This was exactly where he wanted them. "You don't know these temples," he said calmly. "I do." He threw a small rock at one of the statues. It hit a hidden trigger, one he had found years ago. Ancient gears ground to life. The temple floor began to move. Confusion broke out among the hunters. Some fell as the stone panels shifted under their feet. Others fired their weapons, but the shots went wild as the floor kept moving. Era understood immediately. They activated their armor's full combat systems and jumped into action. Their movements were perfectly matched to the shifting floor panels, as if they were dancing. Day moved too, using every trick he had learned in years of training here. He knew which panels would move, which statues would turn. The temples had been built with defense in mind, and he used every ancient trap and trick. The hunters tried to adapt, but they were lost. Their technology couldn't predict the temple's patterns. When they tried to fly with their gravity packs, hidden air vents activated, throwing them off balance. "The cube," Sang shouted. He fired a shot that barely missed Ara. But the cube was already gone. While everyone watched the floor show, Da had hidden it in a place only he knew about. The battle moved through the temples. Hunters fell into hidden pits or were caught by moving walls. Their weapons were powerful but useless if they couldn't hit their targets. Day and Ara worked together perfectly. When hunters chased one, the other would spring a trap. When one needed help, the other was there instantly. They had trained for this, and now their different skills made them unbeatable. Finally, only Sang was left. He stood in the main temple courtyard, rage clear on his alien face. "This isn't over," he snarled. "We'll come back with an army." "No," Era said. "You won't." A bright light filled the sky. A ship appeared above the temples, much larger than Era's had been. The cavalry had finally arrived. As Stellar Guard warriors dropped from the sky, Da looked at the temple complex. The ancient stones had protected Earth's future, just as they had been built to do, though their builders never knew they would fight enemies from the stars. The battle was over. But for Da, a new chapter was just beginning. The morning sun rose over the mountains as the last Stellar Guard ship disappeared into the clouds. Da stood with Era in the temple courtyard, watching the sky return to its normal blue. Around them, there was no sign of the night's battle. The guard had cleaned everything perfectly. "Your world isn't ready to know about us yet," Era said softly. Their armor was clean and fully repaired now. "We have to remove all evidence." Day nodded. He understood. He looked at the temples, where guard teams were carefully fixing every broken stone and erasing every sign of alien technology. "What about the people who saw things?" he asked. "Chief Hen, the villagers. They'll find evidence of a military training exercise," Era explained. "Your government will confirm it. In a few months, it will be just another story people tell." A guard member approached them, holding Era's repaired ship. It had been miniaturized for easy transport. "We're ready," they said. Era turned to Da. "Thank you. Without you, we would have lost the plans. Earth would have been in danger. Without you, I wouldn't have known Earth needed protecting, Day replied. He looked at the temples. All these years I trained here. I never knew these temples were built to guard something so important. Your ancestors were wise, Era said. They built this place to protect knowledge. They didn't know it would one day protect the whole planet. Another guard member called out. It was time for Era to leave, but they had one more thing to do first. They walked together to Jin's house. The old mentor was in his garden, tending his plants as if nothing unusual had happened. The tunnels have been sealed, Era told him, but we left your maps. Future guardians may need them. Jin smiled. I'll keep them safe, and I'll keep watching the sky. You can't tell anyone, Day reminded him. Who would believe an old man's stories? Jin laughed. But I'll know, and I'll remember. After saying goodbye to Jin, they returned to the mountain path where they had first met. Era's ship was ready, hidden behind the trees. Will I see you again? Day asked. Earth is under our protection, Era said. We're always watching, and now we know who to call if we need help. They handed Day a small stone. It looked ordinary, but it felt warm in his hand. If you ever see lights in the sky that move strangely, hold this. We'll know. Dad put the stone in his pocket. What do I tell my students? About why I disappeared for a week. Tell them the truth, Era said. You were teaching someone about survival in the mountains. They just don't need to know their student was from another planet. They both laughed at that. Then Era's ship signaled. It was time. Goodbye, Earth Warrior, Era said, their translator making their voice sound almost human. Goodbye, Star Warrior, Day replied. He watched as Era's ship rose silently into the sky. In seconds, it was gone, hidden behind the clouds. Day walked back down the mountain. His phone had messages from worried students and friends. The official story was already spreading. A military exercise, nothing more. That evening, he sat on his small balcony, looking at the stars. The stone from Era felt warm in his pocket. Somewhere up there, Earth's guardians were watching, protecting humanity from dangers they couldn't yet understand. His phone rang. It was the survival school. They wanted him to start teaching again tomorrow. Of course, he said, I have some new techniques to share. After all, he had learned a lot about survival in the past week. Not just how to hide and fight, but how to work with someone completely different from himself. How to trust, how to adapt, how to protect. As night fell, Day saw a quick flash of light cross the sky. Most people would think it was a shooting star, but he knew better. He touched the stone in his pocket and smiled. Some victories had to stay silent. Some heroes had to remain unknown. But that didn't make them any less important. Dad picked up his teaching notes and added one more lesson. Sometimes the best survival tool isn't technology or weapons or even skill. Sometimes it's simply understanding each other, no matter how different we might seem.